I was really delighted and honored to be asked to moderate this particular panel. I live in this area in the Lehigh Valley, moved here from Brooklyn, and have been active in various organizations here, the Greater Lehigh Valley Writers Group being one of them, and one of the people who was recruited early on by Andy Ladies to be part of the Eastern Book Festival, which has come quite a long way in a short time. Andy is just incredibly gifted in getting people to get things going. So welcome all of you. Thank you very much for being here. This panel is unique. This session is unique in the sense that it is going to be focused on an author of, I'm told, at least 10 books, hundreds of essays, op-eds. He is a prolific writer, and he is a writer who is written about by many other writers and observers of the political and all kinds of scenes, which makes him quite unusual in that circumstance, as far as I know, for the Eastern Book Festival, to have that many perspectives. In addition, he has been writing.
Recording in progress.
From prison. Some have called him a prison writer. And when I was doing some reading of his work and the work of people writing about him, I found just that circumstance quite remarkable and extraordinary, and quite a gift for a book festival. I want to share something with you that I have been sharing with people for a while. Back in the spring, there was an exhibition at the gallery just up the street, Nurture Nature. It involved a group of artists from 8 of them from the East and the Midwest, who didn't really know each other. They were brought together by one person who was familiar with a book called All We Can Save, which is an anthology of essays written by a variety of writers and some poets. And it's about the planet and the shape that the planet is in. And the essays are quite startling. And there's an opening poem in the early pages of the anthology by the poet Adrienne Rich. It goes like this. I am moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I must stand with those who age after age, perversely and with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. Age after age, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. There's just something about those words that just, every time I share them with other people, I am just so empowered. It makes me think thoughts that I haven't thought before. And when I was recruited to moderate this panel, and I began to really read some of the writings of Mumia, the first thing I read from this book, and this book is on sale along, if you've seen the book table outside there, be sure to buy this book. I was struck by a blurb here by the poet who I just quoted, Adrienne Rich, and it goes like this. We outside aren't supposed to feel connected with people inside, least of all those on death row. Mumia Abu-Jamal's eloquent, scholarly, urgent dispatches teach us that we ignore those connections at our own peril. I'm going to read it again. We outside aren't supposed to feel connected with people inside, least of all those on death row. Mumia Abu-Jamal's eloquent, scholarly, urgent dispatches teach us that we ignore those connections at our own peril. I want to make a request of you all who are in the audience and on the panel as well, to just open up to the phrase, inescapably connected. Just hold it. Inescapably connected. While you're here for the book festival, when you go home or reading and whatever you're doing, and as you're listening to the panelists and their presentations, I want you to please do an old lady a favor and just hold that in your heart and in your mind. Inescapably connected. And what I just read from Adrienne Rich. I'm going to introduce the people who are the panelists here. I guess I will start with Todd Steven Burroughs, who is the editor of the Trials of Mumia Abu-Jamal, a biography in 25 voices. I will introduce the panelists, and then they will just follow each other and in whatever order they decide. But I'm letting you know about Todd's first. Then there's Johanna Fernandez. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
Beautiful.
I know less about her, except that that she is a long time. I don't want to just use supporter, advocate, activist on Mumia's behalf. She's a professor of history at the City University of New York. And she's from the Bronx. and she's finding Easton, the bit that she's seen of it so far, interesting. Mark Lewis Taylor is associated with Princeton Theological Seminary, and he is described as Mumia's spiritual advisor, and I was really looking forward to having a real conversation with him and listen closely to him. And that title, what does it describe in terms of his relationship with Mumia? Now, who have I missed? You. Tell them who you are while I find your...
My name is Seth Tobocman. I'm a comic book artist and a longtime supporter of Mumia Abu-Jamal. And one of the publishers of the magazine World War III Illustrated, which Rebecca Migdal is also an editor of.
All right, and Seth was apparently the spark that got this panel, this session going, based on his conversation with Andy. I really find this particular area of your expertise and your work quite new and challenging. Because when I was growing up, comics were Archie and whatever his girlfriend's name was, Veronica, and Dagwood. But World War III Illustrated, and Seth being the publisher of Mumia's comics, is quite extraordinary and something that I'm hoping to learn much more about through his presentation and the dialogue that ensues as a result. Okay, Seth, why don't you begin?
Okay. Hold on, let me get hold on. I have to get my presentation up. Being a comic book artist, I have to make a visual presentation.
While you're doing that, unless you need to speak over it, the thing is when traditionally you think about someone who is a writer, an author, and most writers I know anyway want to be published, and they are not publishers themselves. They have to develop a relationship, some connection with somebody who is a publisher. And so publishers, in my understanding and my experience, provide a very vital connection between people who have things to say in print or in broadcast. Well, not broadcast, we don't use the term publisher, but anyway, they need that connection. And how did the connection come between you and Mumia? I guess you're gonna.
Well, yes, I will explain that. I've got a brief presentation on the connection between Mumia Abu-Jamal and the art form of comics or the graphic novel, which is now something a lot of authors are interested in, although it was less so in the 90s when we started to deal with Mumia. For your information, in case anyone doesn't know this, Mumia Abu-Jamal is a working class intellectual who grew up in the Philadelphia housing projects and was quite brilliant, and at the age of 15 he was writing articles for the Black Panther newspaper, and as an adult he became a newspaper and radio journalist. Unfortunately, in the early 1980s, he was falsely accused of the murder of a police officer, and he has been in prison ever since, where he has written, I believe, 10 books. I first became aware of Mumia Abu-Jamal in the early 1990s. I was living in New York, and I was a member of an anarchist affinity group. And they decided that they were going to do an action disrupting a speech being given by Governor Casey of Pennsylvania, and that we were going to stand up in the middle of this speech with a banner that says, "Talk about Mumia Abu-Jamal," because Casey was referred to himself as a pro-life Democrat, and he felt it was a very controversial thing for him to be a pro-life Democrat, whatever that means, but he had people on death row. So we wanted to confront him with that, and we did. And very quickly, a number of people who were there were arrested, and a Village Voice writer named Nat Hentoff, who was the MC of this event, accused us of violating the First Amendment rights of Governor Casey. And then he not only accused us of that there, but he proceeded to write a column in the Village Voice accusing us of violating Casey's First Amendment rights. And I wrote a letter to the Voice saying Nat Hentoff doesn't know what he's talking about. And Nat Hentoff then wrote a column in the Voice where my name was in every single paragraph. I was Hitler, Stalin, an anti-porn feminist, one of the judges in the Spanish Inquisition. I was in every paragraph by name, and I was like, this is insane. I've never met this man except when I was in the crowd screaming at Casey. So that was a ridiculous situation, but it inspired me to look more into this guy, Mumia, and find out more about him. And I did my first serious attempt at a comic strip about Mumia for the magazine World War III Illustrated, which was called Freedom of Press in Black and White. And these are some pages. And it ends with a petition. You can photocopy and sign a petition to try to get Mumia off death row and out of jail. And because it's a principle that I think is important, that if you're going to write about somebody on death row, you better show him what you're writing. I sent every page of this to him through an activist who worked with him in advance of publication so he could approve of it. And I got a very surprising response, which is that Mumia decided to, he wanted to draw some comics too, and he sent me a comic strip in the mail, this one. And after that, Mumia started doing his own comic strips for our magazine. This is a comic strip about the MOVE bombing, the bombing of the MOVE house in Philadelphia that happened in the 1980s. A comic strip about freedom of religion and how the United States was founded to have freedom of religion, except for, of course, slavery. All right, and here's a drawing he did of the Supreme Court that I think we could all identify with now. And I think he'd be the first to admit he's not a skilled illustrator, but he can draw the inside of a prison with a great deal of accuracy. And this is a piece he did about the separation wall in Palestine. It was for an art show we organized called 3 Cities Against the Wall. And you can see here that he really knows his way around designing a comic book page, even though, his drawing skills, are definitely beginner level, but the page design is great. He really, there's a book called Understanding Comics. Mumia understands comics. So not only did we have Mumia's work and my work about Mumia, but we decided that everybody at the magazine should start to do pieces about Mumia. So here you've got on one side a comic strip about Mumia by Greg Benton, and on the other side an article by Mumia that he allowed us to publish. And here you've got a back cover about Mumia, also by Greg Benton. And here you've got an article by Mumia, illustrated by the artist Sue Ko. Mumia is a vegetarian and very much opposed to abuse of animals, and Sue Ko is also very active in animal rights, so it seemed to make sense for her to illustrate his writing. Here you've got an article about Charlottesville, illustrated by Mac McGill. This is Mac McGill's drawing of Mumia, and Eric Drucker's drawing of Mumia. And issues of World War III Illustrated with material by or about Mumia include issue 18, issue 21, issue 22, issue 23, issue 47, and issue 48, among others. I also, at this point, I'm an old guy, so I can teach people how to do what I do. And I have a bunch of students, and I encourage them to design a bunch of stickers in support of Mumia. They are not identified because, of course, you never know where a sticker will end up, so you don't want your name on it. And this is my students' work. That's mine. So if anyone wants some of these stickers to, put on your notebook like you did in school, I've got a bunch of them here if anyone wants some.
Okay.
And that's...
Let me ask you a quick question before we move on. Again, you had no idea that Mumia would respond. You said the response was a surprise to you.
Yeah, I did not expect him to say he wanted to draw comics. I simply wanted to know whether what I was writing and drawing was acceptable to him as a person who was in a very delicate situation, that his life was at stake. I don't normally ask a human being who's the subject of my work to sign off on it.
What was different this time?
That he could die. So I think he has a right to some input on what I'm writing about him. It would be a pretty hostile gesture to put that out without checking in with him. I also was curious what he'd say, you know?
Curiosity.
Yeah, I wanted to know what he'd say, you know, but for sure, I didn't want to put something out that he felt would hurt his situation.
What about curiosity as a characteristic for a publisher? A character trait?
Well, okay, for us, for our magazine, you said, you know, that comics were a certain way when you were growing up. They were that way when I was growing up too. And when we started doing our magazine, we very much wanted to change the way comics were done. And I found if I worked with people who had grown up reading comics and were trying to get jobs in the comic book industry, all their work looked the same. And I wanted to get other voices into the medium, so I thought I had to be open to people who might not be professional comic book artists, but might have an interesting take on the art form. And I think that worked out with a number of different artists who came into the magazine. So yeah, I was very curious in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Do you help us to understand what does a publisher really do?
Okay, I'm not a publisher in the big sense. We have a collective that puts out this magazine. We're an all-volunteer organization. I tell every artist who works on the magazine, you're gonna get twice what I get because 0 times 2 is 0. But, you know, we dealt with all the technicalities of printing something, which back then was photostats, paste up, taking what they called a mechanical to the printer, they photograph it, they print it, you look at how that's done, you deal with the distributor, try to get it out to places, you might sell advertising to pay for the cost of printing, all those things, and those were done collectively by members of our editorial board, such as myself and Rebecca, and your role on the editorial board is determined by that input. So there are about, I think 16 members of the editorial board now. Mm-hmm. There are easily 30 artists or writers in the magazine every issue. And the members of the editorial board are also artists and writers on the magazine, but they also take on the responsibility of getting it published. Okay, all right. Maybe we'll get some other questions about yours realm from the audience. I do have more. So I'm going to turn to you next, Johanna.
Oh wow, I was hoping that you turned to someone else, but
because you have known Mumia for many years.
Many years.
And you have a history that involves him as a political prisoner, as he is described by many, and as a author, and as he was described by Adrian Rich and others as an eloquent communicator. So would you speak to that, and also what might be enlightening for us to understand how, not just what makes Mumia unique, but his ability as a communicator, as a journalist, an author, a radio broadcaster, how those skills have helped to focus his situation and yours as an activist and a teacher, and that also sets him apart from other people imprisoned or given life sentences. It puts him in a particular category.
Okay, so there are many questions in there. Maybe you can prompt me again, but I'll just start by saying that Mumia is one of 2.3 million people incarcerated in the United States. That's, I'm told, the size of San Francisco. We have a large imprisoned population. Mumia is different because he's a political prisoner, which means that he was imprisoned not for what he allegedly did, but because of his political beliefs. He's a veteran Black Panther, a critic of the city where he grew up.
But here,
its mayor.
I'm gonna interrupt you
But-
there.
but
I'm gonna interrupt you because I want you to speak specifically about the skills that he
And
exhibits and how they inform or affect
he's an imprisoned He's an imprisoned radio journalist and intellectual. So that's what makes him different. I mean, there are plenty of people who are writers or who write in prison, but he's actually a published writer. His writing and journalism is something that is in his DNA. He's literally organized his life around the word. And this morning, we happened to have a brief conversation. And I learned from one of the stories he told me this morning that he started his career as a radio journalist in Philadelphia. And he started out in what he described as the copy boy of the radio world, which is that you literally are there to look at the news and capture bites that the host might want to use in their radio hour. So that's what he does at the beginning of his career. He's just looking at what might be interesting for me to grab for the radio host. And that's how he developed, he said, the voice, this baritone, compelling, arresting voice that we know as the voice of Mumia Abu-Jamal. In his job, he was listening to anchormen and anchorwomen on television. And that was his training for becoming this larger-than-life radio personality that he is today. And you can listen to his radio commentaries on prisonradio.org.
Say it again.
prisonradio.org. So he began as a radio journalist in Philadelphia. He was doing projects for the local affiliate of NPR. He's won awards. And I all along thought that Mumia was born with this voice, but we know that you're not born with anything. Anything that you do and do well, you do well because of hours and hours of practice and more practice and just committing to excellence in what you do. So the question is, what is it that makes Mumia different? What is it about his writing?
How has it sustained him over all these years and brought him an audience?
Well, you probably know that the prison is the most unfree space imaginable in society. And Mumia turned inward and decided that he was going to write about everything under the sun, that he was going to be the voice of the voiceless and give articulation and expression to injustice in prison, in the country and around the world. And he started just writing these small vignettes, very short vignettes about anything that bothered him. That rich poem you read is compelling because in it she says that there are things that torment us and we have absolutely no power or control over. And I think what Mumia did in this horrific situation he found himself on death row, wrongfully convicted of killing someone, he controlled that situation of powerlessness through his writing. And
If I
today,
can interrupt you for just a moment about the Adrienne Rich, I take her line when she says, folks, age after age with no extraordinary power, to me is kind of ironic because she says extraordinary power, but they have the power, we do, all of us, as Mumia demonstrated, the power of listening, the power of practice. He was using those powers, which don't seem extraordinary, and that's just listing them, but turn out to be the extraordinary powers that he brought to bear in an environment that totally tried to negate that power. So I don't take her literally to mean we have no power, like we're not elected president of the United States, like who would want to be anyway. But it's ordinary power by ordinary everyday people.
it's fabulous power.
Okay,
No,
continue. I'm sorry, I'm using up your time.
No, sure. I'm glad that you, I mean, yeah, it's, what I thought you was gonna say is that here he is in this unforgiving situation with seemingly no power, and he turns that into a power that has gotten him names, streets named after him in Paris, right, in the outskirts of Paris. So he really trained his voice and his writing, and it's what connects us to him, right? We all, those who advocate on his behalf, we've all come to meet him, advocate for him, speak to him because we heard him on the radio, and we're blown away and said, who is this man? And then we realize, oh my God, this is an imprisoned man on death row. And
it seems
the writing and the voice really are so almost otherworldly that they force you to ask questions about him, about his case.
His language is quite accessible. He's not using scholarly language. Here's a question that I have for you, and I'm interrupting you, I know, but because I think you can give some clarity to this. In reading his own Live from Death Row, which was, I guess, his first book, when I was going through this, he has a chapter, anybody, if you have the book already, it's page 130, and the title is Clinton Guillotines Guinier. People have heard the name Lottie Guinier in connection with Bill and Hillary Clinton and the late Lottie Guinier, and I know a bit about this. And when I saw it again, the connection, I couldn't believe I was actually reading this written by somebody behind bars, giving a 2.25 page analysis of a political situation that could be occurring today, and tells us so much about political power. This is about power, but he had the power to know of what was going on with Lottie Guinier,
So he stays informed by reading. He reads everything that is presented to him. He reads the newspaper religiously, the New York Times, but ultimately his writings has connected him to people who are so bedazzled by him that they commit themselves to making sure he has everything he needs to continue his craft, right? So it's kind of the gift that keeps on giving. You write, and your work outlives you, and connects you to others who take interest in you, specifically because you're on death row, facing execution in a real way twice in the 1990s. And people become enamored of Mumia and his writing and what he's able to do, because you say that this is 2 pages, but as academics, we would be hard-pressed to convey as much as he conveys in 2 pages. And he's able to convey so much in so little, he says over and over again, because he was trained as a radio journalist. And on radio, you have a minute to say what you've got to say, say it compellingly, and grab your audience without any frills, no images, but sound and words and meaning. So that's his training. He stays connected. He stayed connected to his family, to his friends, his advocates, to the grassroots. And I think that people feel that they owe Mumia something because with so little, he has done so much to raise the grievances of people around the world, from Palestine to the Bronx, to South Africa. I mean, Mumia in this book and in others has written about everything under the sun in 2 pages. In 2 pages that deal a beautifully eloquent and powerful blow to any subject analytically.
And this one, let me just infringe on you, use a bit of your time again. He ends this piece saying, "Is it mere coincidence that prior to the dumping of Guinier, Clinton's ratings were the lowest ever? The shameful sacking of Professor Guinier to appease a faction that will never accept him anyway shows that a new Democrat is no different from an old Republican."
Sounds like.
Woo! Totally ahead of his time.
This is one paragraph.
Sounds like right now.
Totally ahead of his time. I mean, with his analysis of the Democratic Party and how it literally emerges out of the ashes of the Republican Party. What's incredible about Mumia, ultimately, I think, is that there isn't an ounce of bitterness in his soul. So you read his work, and it's, he offers healthy critiques of society and its problems, but he leads with love. He leads with measure and with possibility. And I don't know how I would keep my composure under the conditions in which he's writing. I mean, he's writing from death row, again, wrongly convicted, award-winning radio journalist who was talked about in Philadelphia at the time of his conviction as someone to watch for his greatness. So Philadelphia Magazine in 1981, the year he was imprisoned, named him as one in 20 or 15 people to watch in Philadelphia because he was a rising star. So I would be very bitter if I had been in that situation. My life stolen from me. I would be hard pressed to write as beautifully and profoundly lovingly as he does about everything.
And again, quoting from his own book on page 8, and he, to me, this struck about connections, and this has to do with him telling the rest of us outside about no contact visits. He says, this is not just a security rule, it is a policy, a structure that attempts to sever emotional connection by denying physical connection between the visitor and the inmate. It's so startling for those of us, again, going back just to Adrienne Rich, to think of ourselves outside and somebody inside in an environment that is structured to deny, destroy their connection.
Right, we're social animals.
So that's why I was curious, yes, social animals, but I was wondering how does he, well, maybe you don't have the answer for this,
Oh,
but.
where does he find the reserve?
Yes.
The resource?
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're facing execution, which Mumia's execution was stopped like at the 11th hour, minutes before it happened in the 1990s. I think it was August 17th, 1995. I imagine, and I have another story connected to this, that you have to make peace with yourself and with the world. And you don't have to, but you have the option, the choice to make peace with something, and Mumia achieved that. And that's why his writings are so lucid, again, clear, sharp, but without bitterness and enmity. I'll tell you one thing that I didn't know until recently. Mumia is currently in a PhD program, and Mark and I helped shepherd that process. One of the things we had to do was get a transcript for him from his institution, where he got an MA and a BA. He got a BA at Goddard. I don't know if any of you know how difficult it is to get a transcript. Like, they want your firstborn. You gotta give them everything. They don't give a transcript away easily to anybody unless it's you. Like, your fingerprint has to be there. We finally figured out how to get the transcripts. At Goddard, which is it's a special school, alternative education. There are no traditional grades, so I think the grade is literally a remark by the teacher, by the professor. The professor said in this instance, I think his English professor, that Mumia is a brilliant, almost spiritual writer. And what is clear from his studies at the undergraduate level is that he should pursue a higher degree like a PhD that would allow him the time and the space to further develop his writing and analysis. He was doing these studies in the moment of his execution. So Mumia was getting a BA in the in the moment that his execution was before him. So this is the kind of human being that we're talking about.
Okay. All right, next. We'll hear from Mumia's spiritual advisor. And have you say something about that title.
Spiritual advisor, yeah. Actually, I did not take that role until relatively late in my working for Mumia. I started some 26 years ago when I was just using Mumia's writings in my courses, both master's and doctoral seminars, that I had first discovered by picking up a homeless street newspaper in New York City one day. And
Don't let my
found that-
interaction distract you from how you plan to.
No, I won't. I just wanted to let you know I'm
Yeah,
open.
exactly.
I'm open.
I'm
I'm open.
excited about what you're saying, but
Well, so
that's not the way you want it to go, but
no,
go ahead.
that's all right. I can do this briefly. So we found that even if students in our classes didn't agree with Mumia on something, there was something about the way he artfully, through his writing, through the fat and the fire, as it were, made it live with not only confrontation, but a certain beauty. And when I organized the group Educators for Mumia in 1995.
I'm interrupting you now because this is pretty amazing. You found his writings where?
I was ducking out of the rain and I just grabbed a homeless street newspaper and he had a column in there in New York City in the mid-90s. And that's how his writing can appeal to a wide array of people. And remember in 95 he also had a piece in the Yale Law Journal. He's had pieces show up in Forbes magazine. And then of course in his own works that are published by various publishers. So that here is a voice that has this flexibility of audience and yet clarity and moral passion and principle on the political issues that touch not only the Black community that is primary for him and his being in the world, but for all of humanity and those outside the United States as well. So his ability to connect like that has always been crucial, and it really wasn't until the early 2000s when Dr. Fernandez, in fact, got me into the work of visiting Mumia. Before I had just written him by letter or had phone conversations with him as I was organizing the group Educators for Mumia. And by the way, I found out that my other teacher colleagues had also been using in one way or another either Mumia's voice or his writings in their classrooms. And they too, and this is why they wanted to actually organize for Mumia as well as read him. They had found his writings so essential, not just as texts, but as conveying humanity and care that our students needed to hear. And so I think that's why so many of them organized for him. So I found myself over the years writing on Mumia in some of my books as I did and learning from him. This spiritual advisor title, by the way, I don't see the spiritual word as meaning kind of pontificating about doctrinal or supernatural things. If you remember the word spiritual and spirit, it essentially comes from terms meaning breath and wind. It's a matter of opening things up so that you can breathe, so that you make connections. And so if I do something to keep Mumia connected to other people in the movement, carry a message, hey, that's it right there, making connections. So that's that. I thought as just part of what I might do is just read one passage from Mumia just to hear his words. It's not the same as hearing his own baritone voice. On the other hand, because he's an author, students read him aloud, others read him aloud all over, so that can be done too. Speaking of making connections, again, from Life from Death Row, I like so many of his other books, but he talks about the day when he and his fellow prisoners woke up in Pennsylvania to their water being all gasoline smelly and staining the sink, pollution in their sinks, as it were. And he writes this, let me just read a paragraph here. The heavy gaseous odor still lingers, and a dark oily ring stains cups. It makes me wonder about a saying my wife and I share, that bars and steel can't stop the power of love. The dark side of that also is true. Bars, steel, and court orders can't stop the seepage of pollution that afflicts both the caged and the free. Despite the legal illusions erected by the system to divide and separate life, we, the caged, share air, water, and hope with you, the not yet caged. It was for me a jarring revelation. For an instant it took me beyond the bars and over the walls to Love Canal, New York, to Times Beach, and to toxic dumps known and unknown which sit like silent springs of death. I think of white, well-fed families. And remember, Mumia has this capacity to address in a confrontive way the white community as well. I think of white, well-fed families who survive and thrive off houses of pain like this, in rural enclaves across the country, under the illusion of otherness. How many housewives in the surrounding township met sunrise this morning with sleep in their eyes, filled the pot with water for coffee, and caught a whiff of this gasoline rising from the cup and gagged? The earth is but one great ball. The borders, the barriers, the cages, the cells, the prisons of our lives all originate in the false imagination of the minds of people.
The false imagination in the minds of people.
Yeah, and different people will pull different phrases like that into some kind of center of their being and experience the words in a powerful way. I could read more, but I won't. But in this one, he's making connections. I think that's part of his power as an author. I would also add that he is eminently fair. He doesn't compromise his commitment to the oppressed, being the voice of the voiceless, as Johanna was saying. But if you remember during the Rodney King affair, he even wrote an essay called L.A. Outlaw about the police. And he says there that nobody would accuse me of being a cop lover. But he goes on to say that they have been accused again and are being made subject to double jeopardy. Therefore, they are suffering a violation of their constitutional rights. And he wrote on behalf of those policemen, without taking back one whit his critique of their brutality of the young man brutalized in that case. Well, I think my students have been sometimes surprised that when they read him or hear him, they're not just hearing a righteous warrior with a screed of denunciation. They're hearing a person with, again, principle and critique and passion, but one who has nuance, who complexifies things a bit, who establishes a certain humanity with all kinds of people. So I think that's part of his power. And then I was going to add one more thing that I think accounts for his power as a writer. And I thought of it again when I saw the graphic of Mumia arm wrestling the skeleton death in one of the portraits. There's a big move among a lot of scholars in the humanities right now talking about the black folk wrestling with what Orlando Patterson calls social death. The way death is constructed as part of the life way for those in the black community. Well, Mumia being on death row comes face to face with that death. He had to anticipate and come very close to his execution date in August 17, 1995. So he faced his actual death amidst living a social death. And as one of our educators said, and then wrote about in his own work in a book called The Death-Bound Subject, as he said, part of Mumia's power is that he writes about death in such a way that he gives it powerful symbolic form causes other people to think about the systems that create death for them, as well as the system that is bringing him so near to death. And by the way, as Johanna knows well, Mumia often refers to his current place in prison with a life without parole sentence as slow death row. And so he, along with so many of the other aged in our increasingly graying population today, looks at that reality at all times. To sum all of this up, to summarize this colleague of ours in the Educator for Mumia movement, and this is Abdul Yan Mohammed, he said, Mumia has a power to write in such a way that his own presence is powerful, but he takes, and this is kind of nerdy academic language, he takes a collective subject position, a collective subject position. You read him and you know you're reading about a people in very different places, as well as a people who are often without voice and who need the kind of voice that he articulates. Well, I guess I just think those are some of the traits that make Mumia a powerful author. And the other thing I want to close with, I guess, is the point with which Johanna began, is that we have been mindful throughout that Mumia must not be made an icon of. As excellent as he is, as gifted as he is, it makes you aware that so many of the imprisoned have gifts that are being slighted, ignored, and part of Mumia's collective voice is his power to lift many of these other voices. Prisonradio.org, which features his voice, also records the voices and the columns of others in the prison too. So if you go to prisonradio.org, you can read and hear Mumia, but others as well. So for me, it was an entree into looking at the whole problem and system, as it has been for so many of our other colleagues, I think.
But Mark, let me ask you this, how do you avoid, we're talking specifically about Mumia, but in the macro, making icons, it's just.
It's difficult, yeah. I think well, where do you cross the line into some kind of negative position here? I think it's when you foreground a single individual's voice like Mumia without focusing on the larger system and the many others that suffer it. And fortunately, the great thing about Mumia is you can hardly attend to his voice and what he's doing without looking at the larger issues. Think about
That in itself is extraordinary, because it's just whether he would have to be so intentional, that has to be so much a part of it, because otherwise he would just be sucked into it.
He is intentional. In fact, I think Johanna could tell stories about when we're talking about fighting his own court battles, right? He wants to make sure that this is going to be fought in such a way that it's going to benefit others, as when he won the Hep C battle to get Hep C treatment. He remarked to me once, and I'm sure you heard it too, that what has him most psyched about winning that battle is that it is now precedent setting in states like Missouri, and probably other states too, the ability to be treated for Hep C.
But is there something of responsibility for those of us who are, whether we're on the inside or the outside, to be aware of when we ourselves are participating in making icons?
Nice point.
It's a process that the people,
other colleagues.
I mean, what does Rabbi Herschel say? Some are guilty, all are responsible. We're part of the process. So what do you see in your experience with Mumia and outside of that, even with your students too? How do you have people be aware of being part of a process that is elevating people, making them into some again, to use the word icon. And we see that word being used all the time these days in describing people. Oh, so-and-so is an icon, and this is an icon, and that's an icon, and so on.
This is such an important question for our movement, in particular, the movement to bring Mumia home. And I want you to say something, and then I'll say what I can add.
Yeah, only that I think one of the reasons I was drawn to participate in this movement and to the writings was because here was a very special individual whose special gifts cannot be denied and should not be denied. He has special talents that many of us don't have. But at the same time, you're drawn into a person whose talents are being deployed for the larger collective struggle. And he has constructed his discourse, his writings, and even his visitors list in the 80s and 90s kind of reflected an astonishing array, not only of his own family, but of other friends and movement folk that made engaging him a collective process. And with that there, yes, somebody can come along and make a problematic icon out of him, I suppose. But it's a kind of uniqueness that draws you into the larger collective, which is more than any one person can be. That's, I guess, the way I put it.
I think
Johanna may have another way to look at this.
Well, I think this question for me came when I had Mumia speak to my students for the first time. And also when I met him, when I visited him on death row. But I had my students talk to Mumia, prepare questions, and he called into my classroom, live from death row in Pittsburgh, where I was teaching at Carnegie Mellon. And the last question a student asked was, Mumia, you've done such incredible things. You've written so much, you've touched so many hearts. Do you think it was worth it? To which Mumia responded, I do not believe in martyrdom, and I'd rather be home taking care of my children and grandchildren. Mic drop. And I realized, oh my God, the problem with turning someone into an icon is that ultimately you dehumanize them. Whether it's good or bad, it's dehumanization. And it was then that I started making this film that I made, Justice on Trial, the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal, which was the first film to humanize him. So I was determined to interview his sister, I wanted to know who he was, the person, how did he grow up, who were his parents. And I realized then that the United States has been able to imprison such a high percentage of its population through dehumanization. In this case, we're dehumanizing by transforming Mumia into an icon. But the thing is, as Mark said, that Mumia he's a special human being. I mean, he's written 13 books from prison. And not just any books. These are rigorously researched, beautifully, eloquently written books that anyone who's written an essay knows writing is like giving birth. It's not an easy thing. Hard labor. And the spirituality in the broadest sense of the word that you call forth of his writings, that it connects us to ourselves, to others, and our humanity. Even while he's launching pretty, sharp critiques of the system, that's not something that anybody can do. That's so we have to also acknowledge that Mumia is a human being, but he's also an extraordinary human being who's accomplished a lot in his lifetime. And how to do those things and also talk about Mumia in the context of a broader problem an unforgiving problem of hyper-incarceration of Black people and other people of color, is the only way that we do justice to both Mumia and his situation. That this is not just about Mumia, it's a structural problem that forsakes life in this country gratuitously. And we need to tend to that problem and end it.
Todd, are you still there?
Discussion.
Okay,
I'm going
Todd,
to need a transcript of this for the
go right ahead.
by,
Editor of the Trials of Mumia Abu-Jamal, a biography in 25 voices.
This is such an incredible discussion. After Johanna and Mark, I have so little to add to it. Let me just say some very brief things, and we can go to Q&A unless you have some questions, Ms. Tolliver. One, I don't think that the panelists here have been properly introduced in terms of who they actually are in relation to Mumia. And as a biographer, I'm going to have to take some liberties and actually explain who these people are. The people audience that you see on this panel right now, they are champions of Mumia Abu-Jamal. They're not just connected to them. They're not just have friendly relations with them. They're not just committed to them politically or personally. They are champions of Mumia Abu-Jamal. And what it means to champion somebody is very significant and needs to be discussed. These are the people who are up at 2 and 3 in the morning making sure a flyer is done correctly, or making sure that Angela Davis and other speakers show up to an event. These are the people who talk to Mumia in the personal zone, who know who he really is, know his pain, his problems, right? So these are people that have committed their lives to Mumia Abu-Jamal. And so when you interact with them, when you ask them questions, I just want to explain to you that, because I think it's important to say that so much of this panel's lives has been given to Mumia, because Mumia has given so much to the world and to this cause of justice. So I just wanted to make sure that the audience understands that these people are champions. They're not just activists involved in a cause. Because of the nature of this phenomenon that is Mumia Abu-Jamal, the creative tension between making him this martyr, making him this symbol is very difficult. Mumia has even talked about that. He said, to call me a symbol is to dehumanize me, right? So there are a lot of tensions just by the very nature of the phenomena, and that is one of them. But again, so much has been said that I would have said. I'm going to stop here. And if you have some questions for Ms. Tolliver, I'll answer them. If you want to go to the audience, because I think this has been one of the best discussions about Mumia Abu-Jamal I've heard, read, or seen. And I look forward to putting this in my own book on him, and my second book on him. So if you have any questions.
Mike, I thought you said that this was the second book. This, the biography in 25 voices is the second book that you've done on Mumia?
Right, I have a full biography of him as a journalist that is 340 pages that I have not yet released yet, because he's still in the process of living and fighting and writing.
To structure this book, a biography in 25 voices, what was your inspiration for it? What were you looking to achieve by making a biography using 25 different voices?
My inspiration was the documentary film W.E.B. Du Bois, a biography in 4 voices, that had Amiri Baraka and other people take over a part of Du Bois's story. And so it was a documentary that literally had 4 narrators. And each took a part of Du Bois's life and narrated a part of it. So my inspiration was that. My inspiration was also the book In Defense of Mumia that was done back in 1996 when some activists and people got together. The book was an outgrowth of a artist collective Mumia event that I believe was at the New Eurekan Poets Cafe. And they produced a book on that.
Mhm.
So those were my inspirations.
Now,
I was
did
originally
you
going
know,
to
did
do
you
a
know
book.
the people who produced those two things, or did you just happen to come upon them and they inspired you? What was the connection there?
Oh, I just came across those things and I loved them. And I in fact I was telling Seth before the event, I was jealous for not being in Defense of Mumia. So I definitely had it in the back of my mind that, I wanted to do my own version of In Defense of Mumia. And that's what I wound up doing. So I was very happy about that. Though that book and that documentary were very important to me because I saw that, sometimes you have to look at a subject from a lot of different angles in order to get knowledge about that subject. And in both cases, in that documentary film and in this book, In Defense of Mumia, I got so much information about the subject. I thought it was a good way to approach this particular book at this particular time.
Seth, you're nodding your head to this.
Yeah, I'm nodding my head.
Not because you're sleepy, I hope, but because
No, it's not 'cause I'm
you say
sleepy.
something that
It's,
resonates
well,
with
first
you.
because we had the conversation before,
Uh-huh.
and because a lot of different people have written about Mumia, and I'm impressed with this anthology, with how thorough it is, that I showed you I had stickers my students had done about Mumia. I gave them this book because it's completely up to date, and it also has a lot of different points of view. It's not just, a party line, let's cheer for Mumia book. It's like all these different people's points of view, including an interview with Larry Krasner, who's the DA right now, including an article that's critical of how the case was handled. So he hasn't been afraid to go to a lot of different people and get each person's point of view into the book. And so I felt that if I wanted to bring someone into activism around the subject now, this is the book I would give them, because it's all in there. That there's nothing you need to know about Mumia that isn't in that book somewhere. So I think it's a really good and useful book.
That's very kind. I was
Todd, go ahead.
I was inspired because again, what I was going to say was I originally was going to do a book just on his FBI files, and I was going to have some commentary about that. But what happened was Mumia almost died in the spring of 2021. And I happened to be on the Mumia listserv, and I watched people like Johanna and Mark and all these people spend hours of the day and night. I mean, I lost 3 years of my life just observing them, right? So I can imagine the kind of pressure they were under. But they love Mumia. It's a personal love. It's not symbolic. It's not martyrdom. It's a personal love for a person that they feel has a high level of humanity. And I watched him for 3 months fight to save Mumia's life when he had some heart problems. And as a result of that, I decided to be a very unethical journalist and biographer and basically do a academic smash and grab by putting together some transcripts and some other things. So, I'd like to thank the people involved, particularly Johanna Fernandez, for not suing me, which they could definitely do if they wanted to, right? Because I thought I could put this on a website and nobody would read it, or I could put it in a book and make it solid, right? Putting something in books, even today in 2022, makes something solid, and allows the
Yes.
reader to interact in a way that they take their time and they become invested. And that's what I wanted. And so luckily I had a small independent publisher from Brooklyn, Dr. Kwasi Kanadu, the Colgate scholar at Colgate University, the MacArthur Foundation scholar at Colgate University. I was able to get it published by this small Black independent publisher. And, and by the way, the book, all the proceeds from the book go to Love Not Fear, the one of the main Mumia organizations, as well as the Jericho movement, which is the collective group fighting for the freedom of all political prisoners. So I don't make a dime from this book. And I thought it was important for me to do that as well, because of the situation many of these former Black Panthers and radicals are in. So that's basically the story of the book.
Okay, all right. Thank you for that. Any questions from those sitting on the other side of the camera here?
I really appreciate this panel. It has been an excellent consciousness awakening for me. I was wondering what you would recommend as a first book to read of his collection. As an introduction.
You would recommend?
I mean, it sounds, I wouldn't know where to start when you tell me how many books he has written.
I'll make two recommendations because I made them to my students. I recommend Live from Death Row, which is his first book, which is the one that put him on the map all over the world. And I recommend Todd's book. Okay, so I recommend these two.
I definitely
That's what I
recommend
told.
this
That's
one.
what I told my students to read. It seems to work.
This might sound funny, but I don't recommend my book. I recommend Live from Death Row, and I recommend We Want Freedom, Mumia's History of the Black Panther Party. Mumia has produced major works of American history from behind bars, including being the pioneering scholar of jailhouse lawyering, how inmates become lawyers and help themselves out in their own cases and in other people's cases. Mumia Abu-Jamal is a jailhouse lawyer and did a scholarly treatment of, including interviews he did where he sent out questionnaires to do interviews, for this work. So I would recommend those three books. I also want to recommend, as a side note, Johanna Fernandez's amazing seminal history of the Young Lords Party, which has been an award-winning book, and it deserves all the awards that it's gotten. And I think the Young Lord Party, as kind of a parallel history of how you learn from the Black Panther Party, would be a fourth book I would recommend. So I would go pretty much in that order.
Dr. Fernandez also has a book called Writing on the Wall, Selections from Mumia Abu-Jamal, which collects his writings from early to more recently. It's a really great start to get an overall view. I will say I found myself going back to Live from Death Row recently for the first time in many years, and I was impressed again with its power and the kind of glimpse it gives into Mumia's powers as a writer, what life was like on death row. One of my favorites is the book Death Blossoms, Reflections by a Prisoner of Conscience. Very short pieces, sometimes just a page or a page and a half, but again, jam-packed with meaning.
So very quickly, I agree with Todd that one of Mumia's best books is We Want Freedom, A Life in the Black Panther Party. The first chapter of that book is an introduction to the Black radical tradition, if you want to understand what that is. And then he writes just chillingly about the history of the Black Panther Party in the 60s. So he's not just writing about the Black Panther Party, he's writing about the era. I'll just read what Mumia wrote when Nina Simone died. And this is in an essay in my collection of his essays titled Writing on the Wall. He says, who will sing of the wonder, the terror, the beauty, and the madness of Black life in this new century? On Nina. I mean, so that's what Mumia does.
Say it again.
That's what Mumia does in a sentence. And whoever, if you know Nina Simone and her music, you will connect with this sentence, with this question.
Again, please.
Who will sing of the wonder, the terror, the beauty, and the madness of Black life in this new century? That was part of his ode to Nina Simone.
And he's asking it directly to the reader.
to the reader, yeah.
Who's gonna step up?
Yes, exactly. I just want to thank Todd for acknowledging our work. Doing political prisoner work in general is unforgiving, it's hard. I want to thank Mark, who's the founder of Educators for Mumia in the 90s, but he's the reason why so many people know about Mumia, because he organized that beautiful one-page ad in the New York Times calling for Mumia's freedom at around the time of the execution. No? And you brought it with you.
I brought it with me.
Oh my God. So he organized, this is a Herculean task of herding cats to get academics and educators to sign this petition to free Mumia. And that's something that will always be remembered, that is in history. Everyone who knew about Mumia in the 1990s remembered the moment when all of these people stepped forward as supporters of Mumia. And it was in the New York Times, it was public, it made a huge impact, and Mark Taylor single-handedly accomplished this. I think Todd's book, The Trials of Mumia Abu-Jamal, which I've not yet read because I've been out of the movement for the last year because I've been ill. It's beautiful because it seems to be in the voice of a lot of the people in the movement. Is that correct, Todd? I mean, that's a gift
correct.
to the movement, to the world, and definitely to the people in it, in this movement.
All right, Rebecca.
I have a question that's addressed generally to everyone on the panel regarding Mumia's role as a political prisoner journalist. Because although that the way that the panel has represented it, that connection is implied. I just wondered if you would delve a little bit more deeply into the aspects of his story and his trajectory that are related to the way in which the system tries to silence voices of dissent, and how that has miraculously backfired on the silencers in this case. I wondered if any of you had anything to say about that aspect of this extraordinary story.
I do actually, which is there's phrases that have been used a lot in the last 5 years, such as the prison industrial complex, and there's been a discussion of the role of imprisonment in the society that has been taken up by many, many people, particularly younger people. And the first, other people may have had more education on this than me, but the first time I saw those phrases used in the 80s were in the writings of incarcerated intellectuals, such as Mumia Abu-Jamal and Tim Blunk and various people who we refer to as political prisoners, that is, people who've been politically active in the more militant aspects of the movement of the 60s and 70s and wound up with long sentences and were writing about what they observed inside the prison system. So I was reading those in the 1980s, and that's the first place I saw the discussion of how quickly the prison system in the United States was growing. And in fact, I think in Mumia's original set of radio essays that were supposed to be on NPR and then weren't, he referred to himself as a resident in America's fastest growing block of public housing. So that this observation that something was going on with our prison system, that it was getting bigger and bigger, this was coming from these folks who, were politically conscious people who'd been dropped in the middle of this, machinery that none of us are supposed to see, and who were able to write about it. And now that language has been taken up by a lot of people, including the current district attorney of Philadelphia, Larry Krasner, who got elected talking about this. Okay? But the people who were originally writing this, are not being given very much help.
Yeah, we all no doubt realize that in many countries, to be a journalist is to be on the front line of dissenting communities. And Mumia certainly was from the very beginning. I think it accounts a great deal for the attacks he's had from the system in Philadelphia. I was rereading again before this event Mumia's short paragraphs on each one of the people in the Move 9 who were in prison. When he was in prison, he wrote short, eloquent blurbs about how when he was a newspaper reporter and radio journalist, he went to talk to them and he interviewed them.
Yes, on the eve of Mumia's conviction, he was an award-winning radio journalist, exposing City Hall, writing about police brutality, exposing the mayor of Philadelphia for talking about white power at a rally about housing and the exclusion of Black people from white housing in Philadelphia. So he was someone to watch, a journalist to watch, not for his brilliance as a young person. He was 28 when he was imprisoned, but as someone to watch who's exposing the system. So he's a radical radio journalist, and radical means, for those who know about the roots of that word in history, those are the people who are trying to expose the root causes of social problems and trying to do something about it. Again, Mumia was doing it with depth. He was not alienating people, right? He's bringing people with differing political views together. That's what he seeks. And I think that we should play, Mumia happened to call me this morning and I told him that I was coming here and he recorded something for us. But I wanna say that Mumia won the coveted Columbia University Edward Howard Armstrong Prize in Broadcasting for his report on Pope John Paul's visit to Philadelphia in 1981 or 1980. So this, while this was for NPR, this is the person that that had to be silenced. He was not just talking.
What was this award again?
This is the Edward Howard Armstrong Prize in Broadcasting.
Who was Edward Armstrong?
This is someone who's tied to the invention of the radio. Columbia University gives this prize, and this is apparently a very coveted prize among broadcasters.
I asked that because, but anyway,
Yeah.
go ahead.
No,
Go ahead.
so the people who are in the business know this. Oftentimes, his radio accolades and his profession is undermined and dismissed by the Fraternal Order of Police and people who sought his execution and want him to die in prison. But we need to remind people over and over that he was a brilliant radio journalist at the moment of his imprisonment. And this is what I want to say finally about this, that had Mumia been a white radio journalist, people would have asked questions. Really? An award-winning radio journalist killed a white police officer in Philadelphia, it wouldn't have happened. There would have been questions asked by the public, by the media.
Well, I think we could go on in discussing a lot of this. I don't necessarily, I think a lot of what you raise and others have raised, it should really be discussed at great length. I personally what I would love to hear from Mumia is his take on what is a journalist, who is a journalist, also about prizes and how that ties into creating icons and people who are celebrated. It's to me a double-edged sword. I would love to hear his take on that. I think it would be very clarifying because right now, it seems to me anybody can be a journalist. Anybody always could be a journalist. I want to just call your attention to page 6 of the Live from Death Row, where Mumia writes something that is so just thoughtful, startling, and obvious. All death rows share a central goal: human storage. Prisons treat prisons treated as prisoners treated as bodies kept alive to be killed. So it's so
Sounds like animals.
straight. All death rows share a central goal: human storage. Prisoners treated as bodies kept alive to be killed. Okay.
Macabre.
Anyway, that concludes you. Do you have the whatever it is you want to like?
And thank you to Seth for bringing us together.
When Professor Fernandez, Johanna, first told me about Easton, Pennsylvania, a light went on in my head. And it's a distant memory, but, you know, unless I'm just going crazy, I believe that Easton was the home of the heavyweight champion of the United States, a guy named Larry Holmes. And he fought some pretty spectacular fights back in the old days. And, you know, in the old days, you would remember when someone got into the ring, what's the first thing they said? The announcer would always say, and coming from the great city of, and he would say the city, and then he would name the fighter, you know, Eastern PA, Larry Holmes in this corner. And, you know, so that's where it rings in my head. This great fighter and me watching as a boxing fan. And that's probably the extent of anything I can recall about Easton, but it's pretty remarkable. And Larry Holmes kind of put Easton on the map, at least the recent mental map of what Pennsylvania looks like outside of the big city of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. So there you have it. That's what Easton means to me. And hopefully, I think after today, it'll mean something else. And I certainly hope so. So in this corner is Easton, Pennsylvania. And who knew that in Easton there would be a book fair? But you know, it appears to me that in places like Easton, in places that most people really haven't heard about or really haven't visited, are people just like us, around a table, gathering together in a small community center, reading. And, you know, I think this is a time to kind of read to think, to imagine a new world, a new America, and a new kind of lease on life in a country that is, I think, going in the wrong direction and traveling down the road of fascism. So when people think together, when they work together, and when they even breathe together, change is possible. Because, you know, it takes ideas to move the world. So I'm glad to hear about this book festival. As a writer, I love book festivals. And so keep on keeping on, keep on reading, keep on transforming the world. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu-Jamal.